Hey everyone, this is Daniel for Rock the JVM, and you are watching a comprehensive demonstration of how to test functional Kotlin with the error library. Now, specifically in this video, we're going to focus on the Raise DSL. We have a bunch of videos here on the Rock the JVM channel on how to write functional error handling in Kotlin with the error library, and specifically with the Raise DSL. And so this video is a follow-up to that so that we can maintain the safety enabled by the Raise DSL, and still we can eliminate the boilerplate and keep our tests nice and clean and short. So if you want to make the most use out of this video, I recommend you watch the series on functional error handling in Kotlin with the error library. We have a bunch of videos here on the channel. I'm going to leave links in the description, and write code with me so that you can get these skills for yourself. Obviously, we also have an article on the blog from which I'm going to also copy some code at blog.rockthejvm.com. You can follow this shortly. So this is the empty IntelliJ IDEA project that I've set up for this project. And here under build Gradle DSL, I added a bunch of libraries that you can also add from the article. So I'm going to leave a link to the article in the description. It's called Raise Your Tests, Testing Functional Kotlin with Error and Raise by my longtime collaborator, Ricardo Carden. And here under the first item, setting up the project, you can take the dependencies and add them to your build Gradle. So if you want to follow along, just copy this code and add that to your build Gradle KTS. And after you've done that, I'm going to create a little package here under source main Kotlin. I've already done that. It's called Rock the JVM testing Raise. And I'm going to create a new Kotlin file. I'm going to call this portfolio. And here under this portfolio file, I'm going to add some definitions enabled by the setup. So we're going to simulate a little fintech mini startup in which we're going to create portfolios for stock exchanges or things of that sort. So I'm just going to copy this code just to consider this as a starting point. So I'm going to import Raise from ArrowCore. So you can have import ArrowCore Raise everything. And we're going to describe what we're doing here, and then we're going to write the code from scratch because I'm going to describe my thinking process, which I believe is the most valuable part of such videos. So we're going to create a portfolio in our little fintech application. We describe that by data class, by user ID, and an amount. And we have user ID and money and portfolio ID all as value classes. We also described value classes in another article here on the channel. And we also have a domain error. We're going to deal with errors a little later in this video. And the API that I want to expose for the functionality of this fictitious startup is called Create Portfolio Use Case, and we have an extension method called Create Portfolio. Now, let me expose a little API. So I'm going to have, let's call this the user facing code. Right now we have this interface, so I'm going to have a little function. Let's call this create portfolio use case. And this is going to be an instance of this interface. So I'm going to have create portfolio use case, and that's going to be an anonymous class. Let's say an object that extends create portfolio use case. Obviously, I'm going to override this method. So raise domain error, create portfolio, and so on and so forth. Right now we have a to-do. Now, if we follow test-driven development, we might want to test this function first before we write an implementation. So here, I'm going to go ahead and create a bunch of tests under source test Kotlin. I created a package with the same name, Rock the JVM testing Raise, and I'm going to show you how you can test such code with the Raise DSL using various testing libraries in Kotlin. So first, I'm going to take a JUnit approach. So I'm going to have a Kotlin file. I'm going to call this create portfolio use case. Let's call this JUnit 5 test. And this class is going to be, it's going to have a bunch of methods annotated with the @test annotation. So I'm going to create, let's say, a private val. Let's call this code under test or value under test, which is create portfolio use case, so the function that we would like to implement. And I'm going to have a little function, and usually we can name these functions in backticks with a very descriptive name, like a user ID with an initial amount should create a portfolio, like this. And I can start that with a to-do. So I'm going to focus on this, and I would like to annotate this with @test. just to make the code compile, I'm going to say unit here. And I'm going to have @test that I'm going to import from Kotlin Test. So Kotlin Test is the standard testing library for Kotlin. It's based on JUnit 5. And notice that once I've added the @test annotation, this function is now a regular test. The to-do actually throws an exception, so the test will fail. And this class is going to be considered a test suite. Okay, so we pretty much have everything that we need to implement the test first, and then the actual code, if we want to run this thing, is going to fail. So it's going to compile for a bit, and then it's probably going to fail because the to-do throws an exception. All right, so right now this test failed because we have a not implemented error. That's okay. All right, now this create portfolio use case is going to be an object that has an API in the context of the Raise DSL. So I'm going to have, let's open this with some curly braces, and I'm going to have, let's call this result of computation. And this is going to be either a raise value or an either. And I'm going to use the either type. We demonstrated either in one of the videos on the Raise DSL. So either, and the error that I'm going to use is my domain error. And the right value, which is my desired value, is a portfolio ID. So portfolio ID. And the either needs to be imported from ArrowCore. I'm going to import ArrowCore everything. Now, in order to obtain an either, we need the either DSL. So either like this. And the either DSL takes a lambda with receivers, and the receiver is raise domain error. So in this case, I'm a raise domain error. And because I'm a raise domain error, if you remember the API, if I'm in the context of a raise domain error, then if I have access to this object, I can create a portfolio. So I can use the with directive. So I'm going to say with under test. So code under test. Then in this case, I'm also a create portfolio use case. So I have access to my create portfolio method. So create portfolio on a user ID. So I'm going to say the create portfolio method takes a create portfolio data class. I'm going to have, let's say, create portfolio with user ID Daniel, my name, and money. Let's say I have 99 bucks, like 99.0. Okay, so in this case, we have an either domain error portfolio ID. Now, because we have a valid user ID, I should have created a portfolio. So how on earth are we going to test this either? Well, we can use regular assertions, or we can use one of the auxiliary libraries for testing error code. So I can use assertions from AssertJ. I'm going to say assert that, and assert that the result. And we can actually try to get that value. I'm going to say get or null, which is a regular nullable Kotlin value, is equal to, and maybe I'm expecting, so the create portfolio returns a portfolio ID, and let's assume that portfolio IDs start with 1. So I'm going to say is equal to portfolio ID with the string 1. So portfolio IDs take the value ID of type string. Okay, so assertions assert that. So this is a regular Kotlin assertion, or we can use an auxiliary library. In fact, actually created by Ricardo, the author of the article itself. So I'm going to say either assert, which is a utility from our card in AssertJ. So I'm going to say either assert dot assert that. So the API is quite similar. I'm going to pass the result there. But instead of trying to get the value inside, I'm going to say contains. So contains on right. So on the right side of the either contains portfolio ID with 1. So in this case, this assertions first asserts that the result is of type right, so it contains the desired value, and that the right value is this exact value. So if it's a domain error, then this test will fail. So right now, this thing will fail because the method doesn't have an implementation, so this has a not implemented error, but our test is complete as it stands. So we have either assert, which is specifically useful for values of type either from the error library. So this kind of library provided by Ricardo himself will prove to be quite useful rather than trying to fetch the value from the either and trying to force that to something else. So let me get back to the method implementation, and instead of to do, I'm going to implement this quite quickly. I'm going to create a quick and dirty variable. Let's call this max portfolio ID starting at 1. And I'm going to increment max portfolio ID plus equals 1, maybe starting at 0. And then I'm going to return portfolio ID with max portfolio ID. That's going to be it. So I'm going to have this sucker do string. And that's going to be my really quick implementation. Obviously, a real startup is probably going to have some more complex code. You're never going to use double for money and things of that sort. But the testing skills will probably be important for such a thing. So back to the tests, if I try running the suite, our tests are going to start passing. So the test, which is a user ID with an initial amount, should create a portfolio, is now a pass. Great. Now, there's an equivalent technique with raise assert instead of either assert. So either assert tests values, and raise assert makes sure that the value of type raise succeeds instead. So I'm going to copy this test, and I'm going to create a user ID with initial amount. Should create a portfolio. I'm going to say using raise assert. And I'm going to have this computation, which is my important thing. And instead of using a result and then using either assert on that, I'm going to use raise assert. So raise assert from the same library made by Ricardo. So raise assert dot assert that. And I'm going to use the block here with under test, create portfolio, whatever. And then I'm going to say succeeds with portfolio ID 1, which reads a little bit more human language. So assert that as long as I have this code under test, the API succeeds with portfolio ID 1. So with minimal training, this sort of test will read in almost natural language. And this test will succeed just as fine because we're testing the same functionality. So raise assert that with the code under test, the API succeeds with portfolio ID 1. So the reading here is quite nice. Now let me show you a different style with another testing library called Kotest. I'm pretty sure you have encountered it. So I'm going to create another class here under source test Kotlin this little package. I'm going to have create portfolio use case. Let's call this Kotest. So this is going to be another style of writing tests. And this extends a certain interface in the Kotest library called shouldSpec from IO Kotest. Okay. Now, shouldSpec takes as a constructor argument a little lambda that runs tests in sequence. So I'm going to have, let's say, the value code under test, and that's going to be create portfolio use case. So this is the object that I'm testing. And I'm going to run a special function called context. So context is a test suite. So I'm going to say create portfolio use case. And under context, you can add individual tests with a function should, like this. So should, let's say, create a portfolio for a user with a lambda, and this is the code that is going to be subject to this test. And because this extends shouldSpec, notice that we have some icons here under IntelliJ to be able to run these tests. This is going to be a massive test suite. Okay, so this is the use case, and the portfolio use case is test suite, and here we can have multiple shoulds. So I'm going to say should maybe error out if user ID is invalid or something like that. So you can add many tests, and this turns into a test as well. And this is a test suite that has multiple tests, obviously. So you can add as many shoulds as you want inside a context, and you can add as many contexts as you want inside this shouldSpec. So this is the general style. Now, back to the Raise DSL. So I'm going to go back to my create portfolio thing. So I'm going to have, let's call this result as either. And the type here is not important because Kotlin will infer that for me. So error core raise whatever. And I'm going to have under or with code under test. I'm going to try to use this API. So with code under test, I'm going to return create portfolio with the same parameters as I did earlier. And this is going to be an either. So either with the domain error as the left undesirable value and portfolio ID as the desired value. I'm going to import the either type. And instead of using the AssertJ library, I can use result should be left or should be right. And this extension method is granted by the should spec, and that is granted by the Kotest arrow compatibility library. So I'm going to have result should be right, and I'm going to have portfolio ID with 1. Again, this will read almost like natural language. So the result should be right with portfolio 1. So this is going to be the general style. I want to show you mocks as well. So let me go back to the portfolio API and let me add a little domain error. I'm going to call this a data class, and let's call this portfolio already exists with a val user ID as user ID, and this extends domain error. Now, assume that we have some sort of repository in our little fintech application that returns the number of portfolios by user ID. So searching in a database, and if we get anything other than 0, so 0 portfolios per user ID, then we're going to throw this sort of error. So I'm going to have an interface. Let's call this user portfolios repository. And from the hexagonal architecture point of view, this is going to be a so-called port. So we can interact through layers of an application through these sort of ports. In this case, is going to be a layer that interacts with a database. And I'm going to have a fun, let's call this count by user ID. I'm going to have a user ID as a user ID, and this is going to return an int, let's say. So this is going to be my so-called port, and I'm going to change this API a bit, and this create portfolio use case is going to take the repository as an argument. So I'm going to have my repo as a user portfolios repository. And here I'm going to say ensure, so this is an API from the Raise DSL, ensure that the repo.count by user ID on this user ID, which is model.user_ID, is equal to 0. If not, I'm going to raise an error. So using the Raise DSL, I'm going to say raise the domain error. So I'm going to have my portfolio already exists. Portfolio already exists with the user ID. So model user ID. And this is going to break the flow of the application. And otherwise, I'm going to return portfolio ID with 1. Obviously, our tests are not going to compile anymore, but I'm going to have to pass a repository. In this case, because this JUnit 5 will use an API that depends on something else, this can very easily become either an integration test or still a unit test with either stubs or mocks or fake objects. Now, entire books have been written on this subject. What I'm going to use is a fake object, which has a working implementation, but it takes some sort of shortcut, which makes it unsuitable for production. So I'm going to have a private val. Let's call this fake user repo. And this is going to be a user repository, so user portfolios repository. And I'm going to make an object that extends this interface. So user portfolios repository, where the function count by user ID is if user ID is the same as user ID with Daniel, then I'm going to return 0 else 1. Okay, so this is super easy. I'm going to return that as a single expression. Okay, so this is going to be my fake user repo, and this fake user repo is going to be passed as an argument to my code under test. And in this case, my test is still going to work. So let me put this private val in the other, where is that? The Kotest one. So I'm going to have the fake user repo, although here I cannot really use private val because this is a regular lambda. And all my tests should still work. So first of all, the code should compile and the tests are still going to work. But rather what I wanted to show you is how you can test whether an API raises an error. So I'm going to say should raise an error if the portfolio exists. Okay. And I'm going to have, let's say, val Alice as user ID with the name Alice. And then I'm going to have my result, which is my either thing. So either with create portfolio instead of the user ID Daniel, I'm going to have Alice with whatever money she has, like $99 million or whatever. And then I'm going to have my result should be, in this case, it should be a left because this either is going to fail. So I'm going to have portfolio already exists with the user ID Alice, like this. So in this case, the API is going to fail, and that is expected. Okay, so the test is still going to work. Okay, so this is how you can also test whether a piece of code raised. I'm also going to use mocks, for example. So I'm going to use MockK. I'm going to create, let's call this val. Let's call this mock user repo, which is a user portfolio repository. And I'm going to use MockK. So MockK like this. And mocks are programmable objects that provide specific results in specific conditions, which is different than the fake object / stubs that we used earlier. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to put that in a separate test. So I'm going to say should with create a portfolio for a user using MockK. Okay. And then I'm going to have my mock, and then I'm going to have my, let's call this small code under test, which is my create portfolio use case with this mock user repo. Okay, so mock user repo. So this conforms to the type. And I'm also going to program this mock to respond with either 1 or 0, depending on the user ID. So I'm going to have every mock user repo dot count by user ID with user ID Daniel returns. So I'm going to say returns 0 like this. So the DSL is quite nice. So every time I call this API with these conditions, I'm going to return 0, and I'm going to return anything else for other calls. So I'm going to have my result. I think I messed up some code. So let me put my result either with a small code under test, create portfolio with user ID money, whatever. I should expect that this returns a portfolio ID 1 because this is how I program the mock to respond. So every time I call the count user ID, I'm going to return 0. And if the count is 0, then I should be able to create a portfolio. That's the logic of the test. So let me go run this entire test suite. And obviously, it's a success because we programmed it to be successful. We can also program mocks to raise errors. For example, we go back to my API. In my domain error, I'm going to have a data class. Let's call this generic error with a val reason as a string, and this extends domain error. We can program mocks to use the Raise API to raise generic errors. So I'm going to go back to the Kotest thing, and assuming we have Alice or Bob or something like that, I'm going to say raise an error for specific conditions, whatever those are. And I'm going to have, let's say, Bob. So Bob. And I'm going to have to remove the rest of my code. And I'm going to take this mock that I created earlier and the small code under test and the every call. So I'm going to have my mock, my small code under test that takes the mocked instance as an argument. And instead of programming the mock here in the scope of the test, I can program it in the scope of a raise or in an either call. So in the either DSL, I'm using a raise instance as a receiver. So I can say val result, which is an either with domain error and a portfolio ID. And I'm going to use the either DSL, which gives me access to the Raise API. So I'm going to say every mock user repo count by user ID, instead of return 0, I'm going to say answers. And because I have a Raise instance available, I can use raise generic error with something bad happened. And then I can run the same code with code under test. I can say create portfolio with create portfolio. Instead of Alice, we have Bob and money, $99,100,000 or something like that. So we have the programming of the mock inside the either DSL, which gives us access to the Raise DSL and program the mock to use the capabilities of raise or either. Okay, and then we can test the result. So we can say result should be left. And then we have generic error with something that happened. Okay, so this is the value that we're interested in. Now, the only thing that we should be careful with is to use the actual value that we want to test, which is the local variable small code under test rather than the value from the test suite. So if I run this entire test suite, we should have the test green. We have a bunch of tests skipped because we already tested them. And finally, I can show you regular mocks with Mockito with Kotlin API. So let me go back to the other one with the JUnit 5. I'm going to have another function. So I'm going to say fun should throw an error in certain conditions. Okay, and that's going to be a little function there annotated with @test. Okay, and then I'm going to have result, and that's going to be a similar thing. I'm going to use the either DSL. Okay, and then I'm going to have, let's call this mock repo as mock with or from Mockito. So mock of type user portfolio user repository. And then in the mock as the lambda argument, I can program the mock to say on count by user ID with user ID, in my case was Bob, I think. Then I'm going to say do answer. So this is very reminiscent to the Java API. Do answer, and I'm going to have raise with generic error with something went wrong. So this is how I'm going to program the mock, and the generic error, I'm going to save that as a value. So val the error as this little sucker. And I'm going to say raise the error. Okay. So we can program the mock inside the either DSL, and then I'm going to say with, and I can say the code under test, which I can build here locally. So I'm going to say val my code under test is going to be the create portfolio use case with this mock repo as an argument. So with my code under test, I should have access to the create function. Where is that? So the create portfolio function. So create portfolio on the user ID. So I'm going to say user ID with Bob, and we have money with, I don't know, 1000.0. And we have, I forgot to wrap these in another data structure. So that's going to be the create portfolio data structure. So create portfolio with this structure with user ID Bob and money 1000. So this result, and remember, we're going to say either assert that result contains on left, in this case, is going to be my generic error. So I'm going to say either assert that the result, and then say contains on left the error, which is going to be on the left-hand side, the undesirable value. And that's going to be my little test. Let's run this, and that should conclude this little demonstration. So there you have it, folks. Various testing techniques for functional Kotlin written with Arrow and the Raise DSL combined with various libraries like MockK, AssertJ, and so on and so forth. I hope you liked this video and found it valuable. If you did, go ahead and click the like button for me and subscribe to the Rock the JVM channel for more videos like this. And check out my website at rockthejvm.com. I have literally hundreds of hours of pretty much everything related to Scala, Kotlin, functional programming, and so much more. Until next time, folks, this is Daniel signing off.